So you know how alchemists are often portrayed as the medieval equivalents of modern-day scientists, dwelling in their labs, tinkering with chemical substances from dusk till dawn, looking for the famous Philosopher's Stone. The Philosopher's Stone was a mythical substance or device that could turn common metals into gold. And despite their undeniable charm of medieval Einsteins, they must have been pretty fucking dumb. That is because many ancient civilizations like Rome and Greece, but also most civilizations during and after the medieval period and up to the 1800s, were already aware of at least one such device that would turn common metal into gold: the slave. You take a bunch of them, give them metal pickaxes, chuck them into a hole in the ground, and lo and behold, a while later the survivors come back with gold. Simple, no? How did they miss that? Jokes aside, the point I'm trying to make is that if you have slaves, the incentives to become more productive or automate are small. The mindset of a slave-based society like ancient Rome was completely different to ours. You really need to think about slaves like we think about technology nowadays. I sometimes make Roman-style mosaics as a hobby, and the amount of hours to make one as big as like a tray is insane. Now compare that to the complex mosaics covering the entirety of Roman villas, and you can start to see that the slaves laying those tiles were really akin to automated tile-laying drones. The topic I want to discuss in this video is that of the so-called Great Divergence. It is the discussion about why the West's path towards prosperity diverged so strongly from the rest of the world. A number of factors are often brought up, and the abolition of slavery is always among them. There is a bit of decent content about the Great Divergence out there, but I think that people looking at the topic always stop one step before where the chain of causation would naturally lead, and that is to Christianity. This is probably no surprise to the few of you who actually remember that the West is essentially Christianity plus classical antiquity with Germanic characteristics. Hopefully, this take on the subject is going to be interesting to you. So, what questions are we asking concretely? Question number one is, why was Europe the continent that colonized the world, despite being a relative backwater? Indeed, in the 1500s, Europe had about 20% of the world population and a correspondingly small share of world GDP. China, in absolute terms, was far, far bigger and had better seafaring capabilities. Per capita GDP and living standards were more comparable, but any reasonable observer would have assumed China would be the first in line to conquer the world. Question number two we're addressing is, why did the West invent industrialization? And I use the word invent on purpose, because honestly, in my assessment, it is not clear at all that the East would have industrialized on its own at a later date. China was a large, monolithic and stable state that had hardly any incentive to industrialize. India might have been positioned somewhat better in that regard, as traces of proto-industrialization existed before the colonial era. Okay, let's get started. I'll do a countdown of my top 4 factors causing the divergence, and we'll try to determine what Christianity has to do with creating the conditions for these factors to manifest. Afterwards, I'll address some other factors commonly mentioned, and we'll discuss their merits too. Number 4. The Enlightenment and Science. You might have expected this to be higher on the list. The reason I put this lower is because I think that it is not necessarily a causing factor. The necessary science can also be developed side by side with the technical advancements, if there are enough other incentives for the whole industrialization thing to get going. And the Encyclopedia Britannica agrees with me on this point actually. Studying physics, I always found thermodynamics as an outlier. It had a very different flavor to the other major branches in physics. And I think I realize now that it was the industry informing science and not the other way around. To quote the encyclopedia, it was the steam engine that posed the problem that led, by way of a search for a theory of steam power, to the creation of thermodynamics. Of course, if one can choose, having the science ready and pre-existing is hugely beneficial to speeding things up. So, to reiterate, what is necessary is not that science is pre-existing, rather it is necessary that there is a general sentiment that understanding reality could be beneficial and a proclivity to actually go out and do so. So, while the effects of technology and science on material progress of society are quite clear, it is not so trivial to understand what impulse led to the development of science to the degree in which it happened. Europe did not have a monopoly on natural philosophy. It was the Arab Golden Age that had preserved ancient knowledge and developed it further up until that point. It was from the Arab world that Greek classics were reintroduced to the West, and we count with Arabic numerals today. At the same time, China had an educated caste of imperial bureaucrats doing everything from astronomy to actually creating gunpowder. But progress in these places was mostly the product of intellectual musings and accidental discovery, facilitated by huge population sizes in the case of China. In Europe, on the other hand, there was aimed and purposeful iteration and experimentation. Why was this the case? Simply put, Christian doctrine reached the conclusion that understanding the world is the best way to get closer and understand God. This is a very unique development, which we don't find in any other religion or philosophy. A way one can attempt to see why this conclusion was reached is by understanding that God created the world using the Logos. What is the Logos, you ask? In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. God uses the Word in Genesis to create the world, by literally speaking things into existence. This is the Logos in action. The Logos is the agent that uses speech to shape reality. It is no wonder then that to understand reality we must use accurate and truthful speech. The conclusion is near that understanding the world is the best way to get closer to understanding God. This created the incentive structure to engage in natural philosophy, maths, and later science, which were seen as the closest approximation to the Logos at our disposal. It has also created this notion that progress can exist and could be good. This is really not a trivial thing. Progress, like we understand it, was and still is a foreign concept to most cultures. Moreover, the rigid Christian theology, even in its darkest and most dogmatic hour, was a perfect training ground for scientific thought, as it insisted on the idea that to understand the world, we need well-defined and rigid principles and axioms from which we then derive everything by applying logic. This is a very scientific approach, if you think about it, and we simply happen to not agree with the specific axioms and principles anymore. At position number 3, we find political fragmentation. Despite the Romans' best effort, the European continent had always been a very culturally fragmented continent. Centralization by one nation or the other was the exception and not the rule. At the same time, centralization was the norm in China, with fragmentation only happening after the fall of one imperial dynasty until the rise of the next. Why? The reason for this is probably geography. Europe has a relatively large coast to inland ratio, abundance of peninsulas, and many rivers and mountain ranges big enough to serve as frontiers. This makes it hard to maintain control over vast stretches of territory. Compare this with the fertile Nile Valley of ancient Egypt, or the incredibly fertile plains of the Yellow and Yangtze rivers in China, where the terrain can sustain masses of toiling peasants that are just waiting to be conquered, honestly. So why is decentralization important? Because it means that if you have a good innovation and your lord is not interested in funding you or is even calling you a heretic for trying something new, you just offer your services to a lord that listens. Then, when your idea turns out to be great, the other lords try to copy or develop their own innovations. The political and cultural fragmentation basically led to an arms race of technologies and ideas, and allowed for the parallel development of a free market that could grow without the supervision of potentially repressing hand of a centralized authority. When the Chinese emperor banned trade via sea and had all ships burned, people complied. Trade just stopped and the country turned inwards. This could never have happened in Europe. Here, in this factor, Christianity actually has no role. At position number 2, we find the rule of law. Let's first refresh what the rule of law even means. It means that the social contract is made explicit, in a way that is understandable to the public and enforced by an independent third party. Basically, the rules of the game are determined ahead of time and you don't get to change them at your whim. The opposite of the rule of law is authoritarianism or rule of power or authority, with anarchy smack in the middle of the spectrum as it is the absence of rules. Rule of law always means that the masses are treated better and have more liberties than in a rule by authority. If a king has total absolute power, he will not waste time writing down rules he alone sets and can change at his will. So if there is rule of law at all, it means that there has been a somewhat successful negotiation on the part of the lower classes. So how is the rule of law beneficial? People of authority, be it a king, an emperor, or a caste of oligarchs, tend to be unreliable and hard to predict. So if they set and administer the rules, nobody can know in advance whether they will be complimented or punished for embarking in any sort of endeavor, and if they will be entitled to the fruits of their labor. There is no point in working hard if everything can be taken away from you at a whim. So we need stable and explicit rules that make it possible to compute ahead of time whether trying to go the extra mile and do something innovative could actually be worth it or not. So what was Christianity's contribution to this? It mostly happened via two separate channels. First of all, the rule of law as a concept originated before Christ in the Roman Republic. While it got replaced by imperial edicts in the public domain, it still mostly stayed intact in private matters, even during the Roman Empire. The Church, meanwhile, insisted on the divine nature of the individual, that whether poor or rich, we are all the same in the eyes of God. It is based on these principles that Christianity insists on the virtue of compassion and charity. We are made in the image of God and have a spark of divinity inside of us, and therefore slavery is a direct act against God. By combining these two ingredients, the Church gradually managed to extend and solidify the rule of law and extend it to all, not only Roman citizens as it was in Roman times. But actually the more important channel is the following. The most profound thing that the Church did in general, and this is really one of the most profound cultural shifts that characterized the West as compared to the rest of the world, was that the Church shifted the collective I from the group to the individual. So ancient cultures and Confucian cultures still today see the extended family as the fundamental unit of social hierarchies. In the past, this led to the formation of clans and ensuing family feuds. The mentality was that you can only trust your next of kin while everybody else is a threat. The Church changed the narrative on a cultural level and on a practical level by banning cousin marriages, because this prevented the formation of clans and forced people to start opening up. The correlation between the decline in cousin marriages and the rise of nonconformity, trust in strangers, and desire for fairness is statistically incredibly strong for being a sociological study. How does this have anything to do with the rule of law, you ask? Well, if you have a bunch of nonconformist individualists, you can bet that they will dislike centralized authority enough to force the leaders to make the social contract explicit, and at the same time they will trust that strangers will respect the rules, and they themselves will be prone to be fair and respect the rules themselves, without supervision of a coercive force. And now, finally, factor number one, sort of spoiled this one already, it's the absence of slave labor. I made this point already at the start of the video. If you have slave labor, there is absolutely zero incentive to innovate to increase productivity. Construction workers not building fast enough? Whip them harder. Still not working? Buy more. You can even reuse them for something else later, contrary to specialized tools and tech. Too expensive to buy them on the market? Send your man across the border and buy or capture some there. The same argument holds for any laborer which is not entitled to a major part of the fruits of their labor. That means we also need the absence of serfs, convict and conscript labor to incentivize innovation. So how did Christianity contribute to the abolition of slavery? Well, a unique development in the West was that its most powerful cultural institution, the Church, actively worked against slavery. Starting very early, around the year 600, and taking an increasingly clear stance through a long list of papal edicts, doing things like excommunicating anyone holding slaves by default, made it such that at least on the continent, slavery was effectively extinct by the 1500s, and serfdom was on its way out too. Further away from the homeland, slavery of course reared its ugly head even at the hands of Europeans, but it never compared to what, for example, the Ottomans kept on doing for an additional 300 years, or what was going on inside of Africa and Asia. Christianity used the aforementioned notion of a divine individual. Again, insisting on the divine nature of the individual, but whether poor or rich, we're all the same in the eyes of God, the Church gradually managed to eradicate slavery. Okay, so now we have gone through my top 4 of the most important factors that contributed to the Great Divergence, aka the rise of the West. But there's a lot of other factors that are often mentioned in this debate, so I will go through them and give my assessment on them. The first one is the necessity of a banking system and a credit system. And this is undoubtedly important, but people often make it seem like these did not exist in the past, or would have been hard to develop, which is just not true. Paper notes and credit were widespread in classical antiquity, with even some indication of fractional reserve banking. The necessary tools were already developed or on the verge of being developed. Just like science, in my opinion, a fully fledged financial system is a consequence of increased trade and industrialization and not the other way around. Factor number 2, and this is a tricky one, is colonial exploitation. People argue about this passionately, as for many it is more of an ideological topic than a historical one. But if you look at the fact that there is evidence for saying that colonial exploitation helped the West to industrialize, just as there is evidence for the opposite, namely that the colonies were a resource-draining vanity project that actually held the countries engaging in it back. In the end, there is not enough evidence for either of these, so my guess is, whatever the truth, it didn't really make an impact. But this is still an interesting topic that could deserve its own video. Another factor that is often mentioned is the availability of natural resources, especially coal. And this factor is often brought up by people that focus solely on industrialization. But I think that's a bit of a narrow view of the Great Divergence, because it seems to me like the roots of the Great Divergence go back way more than that. I think you can see the first traces starting around the turn of the millennium, and at the latest, after the Great Plague of the 14th century. So, while of course it is nice to have big concentrated coal deposits in one place, I think that even if that hadn't been the case, we would have found a way around it, and maybe it would have taken a little bit more. But I don't see this the high concentration and high availability of coal deposits as a primary factor. It sure helped though. The next factor is surplus agricultural production. And obviously, yeah, you do need people that spend their time innovating rather than breaking their backs in the fields if you want to have innovation. But Rome had Egypt as its imperial granary, and the Chinese bureaucracy had masses of toiling farmers. None of the two used their agricultural surpluses to get where we are today, so yes, it is a precondition, but it doesn't mean anything interesting beyond that. And finally, the last factor is high wages so people can consume. And this is typically mentioned separately from the abolition of slavery and serfdom, but it's really a consequence of it. If you abolish slavery, the cost of labor will obviously go up, and a plague wiping out 40% of the population helps in that regard, looking at plague outbreak of 1350. So there you have it. I hope this discussion was interesting to you, and if it was, and you think other people would benefit from watching this content, please like, subscribe, and share this video. Bye bye!